Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third in the spring 2022 webinar series on meeting the challenges of digital health evidence generation. It's great to see so many of you online, and I can see that we're still getting more of you. I'm delighted that there are a lot of familiar faces from previous webinars. I'm especially pleased to welcome those of you who are joining for the first time. I should present myself. I'm Paul Wallace, and I am the Clinical Director for Digital at the HIN and Emeritus Professor of Primary Care at University College London. I'm delighted to introduce my co-chair, Dr. Farah Elahi, and our two speakers, Dr. Alice Sibeli and Dr. Annie Murphy. You'll be hearing more both about them and from them shortly. As you will have seen, the topic of today's webinar is how can clinicians find the right digital therapy for their patients? And we're going to hear just how challenging an issue this is for clinicians, commissioners, suppliers alike. It's sometimes described as the Wild West of digital health. And we're going to be looking in particular at the role that evidence can play in helping this. It's perhaps fortuitous, but in any case, extremely relevant, that only last Friday, NICE issued approval for an app-based therapy, Sleepio, for sleep disorder. And this was possible only because really, of the extensive, robust evidence base associated with the app. In the words of Jeanette Kuzel, the acting director for MedTech and Digital at NICE, our rigorous, transparent, and evidence-based analysis has found that Sleepio is cost-saving for the NHS compared with usual treatments in primary care. It will also reduce reliance on dependence-forming drugs such as zolpidem and zopiclone in people with insomnia. So this is a highly significant development which helps to pave the way, I think, for the future in this important field. And in this context, it's perhaps worth mentioning that in the US, something similar has happened with the FDA initiating approval for prescription digital therapeutics. So I hope you'll all agree that we have a very interesting session ahead of us. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the important and generous support from all those involved in organizing and sponsoring these sessions. And in particular, I'd like to nominate University College London, King's College London, DigitalHealth.London, who are actually managing all the technical sides of this, and the Health Innovation Network, which is South London's academic health science network, amongst others. So without further ado, I'd like to ask our two presenters, Alice and Annie, to say a few words about themselves and their role. Let's start with Alice.
Hello, hi Paul. Thank you very much for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I am the Associate Director of Clinical Therapy Design at Mahana Therapeutics. And at Mahana, what we do is we develop digital treatments for people who have chronic health conditions. Before I decided to join the startup world, I worked for over 10 years in the field of health psychology research in different UK universities and hospitals, such as University College London, University of Southampton, Great Ormond Street Hospital, and King's College London. And throughout these years in academia, I was fortunate because I could create, alongside incredible colleagues, clinically validated digital psychological interventions to support people with physical problems. This is really my passion. So I'm incredibly excited to be here today to have this discussion with you and Annie and everyone else. Thank you.
Alicia, thank you very much. We're delighted to have you here. And Annie, I'd like to pass to you if you could give us a little bit of background about yourself.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. So my name is Annie Murphy. I'm a GP at Wideway Medical Centre in Merton, and I'm the digital lead for East Merton Primary Care Network, as well as South West London digital lead for primary care. So I sort of straddle both the sort of clinical user view as well as a little bit of the commissioning view, hopefully. Last year, I was a Digital Pioneer Fellow with DigitalHealth.London, and I'm on cohort 4 of the NHS Digital Academy this year. So there's been a lot of conversation and talk around digital therapies and therapeutics, and it's something that I really want to explore further, because it is truly a minefield, and be willing to try and make sense of it with anyone who's interested in talking.
Thank you so much, Annie. That's really helpful. And I think, Farah, I'd like to ask you as well to introduce yourself, because it would be really helpful to know about you and your role, both in DigitalHealth.London and also in the webinar.
Thank you for that, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Farah Elahi, and I'm the project manager at DigitalHealth.London. And I've been very lucky to be supporting our funders and other colleagues in helping to organise these webinars. And particularly today, as Paul has said, I'm co-chairing as well. So looking forward to the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think then let's go and start our conversation. First, I think probably quite useful would be to understand what each of you, or at least consider what each of you understands by the term digital therapy, sometimes also talked about as digital therapeutics. Can I start, Alicia, with you and then go to Annie? Alicia.
Yes, of course, Paul. So yeah, as you said, I would like to focus here on digital therapeutics, because I think this term will help us to understand some key points that clinicians need to keep in mind when they're assessing and choosing digital therapies for their patients. So digital therapeutics are evidence-based therapies that are delivered by software programs, and they can help prevent, treat, or manage a disease or a disorder. They're not wellness apps, and I think this is a very important point. So they need to be cleared by regulatory bodies, or they need to be certified, which means that they're safe and they're clinically effective. And because of these reasons, it actually takes quite a lot of time to develop clinically validated digital therapies. So there are several stages that underline the development of digital therapeutics, from the clinical and development phase, all the way to the stage when the product has cleared all the necessary requirements. And so it takes time to generate good clinical evidence in the context of research studies to support the regulatory submissions, but also after that in the real world. And I know we're going to be talking about this later today as well. So I guess in summary, there are some keywords for people that they can remember around this: evidence-based or clinically validated programs, regulatory approvals in place, and a thorough development process that embraces best practices. And actually, this requires cross-functional work, because we're talking about best practices around data protection, human-centric design. So it's quite a rich field. One last point I would like to mention is that the Digital Therapeutics Alliance Association has actually useful resources to learn more about digital therapies.
Great. Annie, do you want to take your consideration, if you like, from a different point of view as a clinician, a GP, and a commissioner? What do you understand by digital therapy?
Yeah, it's similar to what Alicia said earlier. It is a digital product or software that can help you manage or prevent a condition. So I think looking at it from a clinician and a user point of view, I think for me, what's quite mind-boggling really is just the sheer vast number of different apps and health tech that's out there, and it's so hard to pick one to go for. And often we end up hearing from a company who will call us up or make contact, and then we will start using a therapy or an app for a particular problem that maybe we hadn't even thought of was a problem before. But there are other problems out there that we need to address. And so for us, I think for me as a user, I think it would be really useful to have almost a standardized set of tools to help us make a decision on what it is. And maybe that's from our experience of using lots of different therapies beforehand or learning from others beforehand. So for me as a user, I think we do need to have a little bit more knowledge and awareness of what all the therapies are, what problems that they can solve, and sort of sharing and learning experiences from others is quite important.
Can you give us some examples? I mean, because exactly as you say, there's a myriad of these, but just to get people centered on them, what sort of areas do digital therapies actually operate in that you've come across, and what's been your experience of them?
Yeah, certainly. There are, for me, two main areas that I have seen a blossoming, as it were, of therapeutics in the digital field. And I think certainly COVID has been the biggest disruptor in this field. I think, 3 or 4 years ago, we may not have seen such a huge influx of different products out there, but now people are much more used to using digital tools to help manage their conditions. So the two sort of areas that I've seen in my practice have been around mental health and remote monitoring for long-term conditions. So certainly in mental health, there have been lots of self-help apps, CBT apps, as well as sort of digitally assisted programs to help someone who's waiting to get face-to-face therapy. And the other area that's really of interest and is evolving all the time is this remote monitoring field. Certainly in established diseases like diabetes, there have been recommendations by NICE and other organizations to use certain things like continuous glucose monitoring. And that over the, since it first came out, was all a new thing and it was limited. But now NICE have just updated their guidance to say that we can recommend for certain type 1s. So it's really interesting to see this evolution, and a lot of it, as Alicia say, have been evidence-based and it sort of gives us a little bit of trust, actually, that it is recommended by an authorized body like NICE or NHS Digital, or an app is DTAC approved, or that sort of thing sort of helps the user decide, oh, maybe this is the real deal, as it were. It has the backing of evidence, and so we feel safer to use it. So
that's a very important point, isn't it? That somehow having it ordered, I think you were saying earlier, it's all pretty disorderly. Having it somehow ordered and having something that says, actually, this is a kite mark, perhaps equivalent to what we have with the BNF, the British National Formulary for standard therapeutics, but also with those sorts of things. I'll probably come back to you, but I wanted to come to Alicia with a little bit further on this one. Looking towards the future, Alicia, how important a role do you think digital therapeutics will play in looking after patients and indeed patients looking after themselves? What are your thoughts, Alicia?
Yes, I think digital therapeutics will play an important role, Paul. Let me briefly explain why. So the NHS mental health care in England currently has a waiting list of approximately 1.6 million people. And we also have a further 8 million people with psychiatric disorders who are not even able to access this waiting list because their conditions are not considered severe enough. And I think that digital therapies can actually help address this issue. Something that Annie was saying is very important, of course, mental health, but also around long-term conditions. She mentioned monitoring, but also we know that digital therapeutics can help with managing long-term conditions. They require ongoing management. This can be via medications, via treatments, or a combination of both. And I think that there are humanistic burdens for individuals, obviously, when it comes to this, but also there are large financial costs for both primary and secondary care. And digital therapeutics can help target both of these issues. So if we use irritable bowel syndrome as an example, we know cognitive behavioral therapy tailored to IBS. So in the US, they call it, gut-directed therapy, is safe, is effective, helps with IBS physical symptoms and also with the psychological distress associated with the condition. And in England now, people with IBS can access this digital treatment through IAP centers. So IAP stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. But there are not enough therapies to support all these people with IBS, and we're talking about millions here. So one of the answers can be CBT, delivered by a digital therapeutic rather than a person. This increases access to this treatment at a much lower cost to the NHS, but it also helps reduce NHS and societal costs of people living with an untreated chronic condition.
Sure.
So I think, and this is just one example, Paul, there's so many long-term conditions that really can benefit from digital therapies.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Annie, I was wondering if you want to comment on that. And also, I think, look at perhaps what the pitfalls might be in us taking a headlong rush to digital therapies for the obvious reasons. I mean, those are very compelling reasons. And I guess this audience wouldn't be here if they didn't feel sympathetic towards it. But there are pitfalls, and I wonder what you see that both as a commissioner and a clinician.
Yeah, sure. I also wanted to pick up on what Alicia was saying earlier with regards to people using mental health apps for self-service CBT. I'm just reflecting on, my clinics pre-COVID, and when I used to suggest using digital therapy to somebody, whilst waiting for IAPT, and everyone's like, no, I don't trust it. It's not going to help me at all. Like, why don't you just refer me? I need to see a person face to face. And now, sometimes somebody comes and, for a problem, I would suggest a face-to-face referral, but they said to me, isn't there an online solution? Is there another way of doing it?
No.
So it's almost reversed in some cases, I'm not saying all, but I do think that there is a place for digital therapeutics, and this space will grow definitely exponentially over the next few years. My only concern with this, and I would like to raise it here, is especially in the sense with remote monitoring, all of these blood pressure monitoring and pulse monitoring and AF monitoring devices and apps that we see nowadays, there is a real risk of information overload for both the person and the clinician. And sometimes you get this sort of data dump sometimes. So we'll get sometimes, an email with a list of readings for no reason, and there's sometimes no reason to do too much or over monitoring, and it can cause even more anxiety in the patient. It can cause, the necessity to try and unpick the reasons behind this health anxiety, because digital is such an easy enabler for somebody to gather information about themselves that it may actually perpetuate. If you are already slightly worried about something, it might not actually help you, it might harm you instead. So just a caveat there to mention.
Thanks very much. Alicia, last sort of comment to you, if you don't mind. One of the things that I think we're always concerned about is that while digital offers lots of promise, and I think, Annie, what you were saying is really interesting, that people are actually now asking for it. Guilty, I do that too. There are some people who won't be asking for it, and indeed may not be able to access it. So the whole question of the digital divide, Alicia, how do you think, how big a problem is that, and how do you think we should address it?
Yeah, I think it is a big problem that we need to think about, Paul. As we are saying, digital therapies actually increase access to psychological therapies, behavioral therapies, and so on. But from my perspective, one of the challenges is that we have an issue with accessibility in deprived areas, which are actually particularly affected by long-term conditions.
Sure.
So even if digital interventions allowed for more access, I do think that there is more work to do. The industry in partnership with NHS and so many other partners, but to actually provide access to evidence-based care to everyone who needs it, because people deserve that. So I think the access to internet clearly is and a fairly fast internet is quite an important point. From my perspective as well, as part of a company, I do believe mobile apps are incredibly valuable in the digital therapeutics world. What I also find in my work is that some people also like the web product, the web-based product, because sometimes even if they don't know, if they don't have a mobile app, they can access that through desktops or laptops that can be cheaper sometimes, or that they can go to someone and do that. So I mean, I know I'm just scratching the surface here, but I think these are just some of my thoughts. I just think there is a lot of conversations that we need to have to ensure this is actually covered. It's an important topic for for sure.
Thanks. And I think probably there's an element of this which is about horses for courses. You don't have to have everything digital. And I think that may be something that we also, us as a group need to remember as well. So I'd like to go, Annie, to you first with the next question, which is, do you actually agree that the market for digital therapeutics or digital therapies is currently a wild west? And how does it look to you sitting both behind your desk as a GP and in your commissioner's role?
I think certainly in both roles, I am extremely confused. There's just so much out there. So I find it difficult to suggest standardized digital therapies in my day-to-day work because I don't know what is standardized. I think that's the problem is at the moment, I only know of the ones that I've already used and have seen benefits from, and then I can recommend them. It would be great if there was some sort of centralized body that could recommend a suite of therapies that you can then pick and choose from. That would be really useful as a baseline for clinicians and end users, because we don't have that time to go and research and go and pilot too many pilots really, and we just appreciate having something that's served to us and that's easy to pick from, like a library almost. And I do know that there's some work towards building NHS approved apps like the Orca library, etc. So a bit more of that would be helpful. From a sort of procurement perspective within a larger organization, I think it's really important that we follow preferably national guidance and frameworks, just so that there is a fair and consistent process in trying to procure something. So again, it would be really helpful to have national procurement frameworks for certain things. There are some at the moment for online consultation, video consultations and stuff like that, but maybe a bit more around the therapeutics side will be very helpful.
Yep, no, that's really helpful. And actually there's a question in the chat, since you've mentioned national guidance and things about Orca. I don't know whether you have had experience of Orca. I mean, we've talked about NICE and we've talked about the FDA in the US. Do either of you want to comment on the role that Orca plays in terms of you being able to judge whether something is worthwhile or not? Annie, is that something you're familiar with?
Yes, they're only relatively recently in the last year or so, I've heard about Orca and how they've been sort of, it's almost like a first pass for yes. Digital. So it's great because if it's been Orca approved on their library, then I know that there are certain minimum standards are met. And so I can then go on to try and pilot that solution to see if it works for me. So I think that that's really useful because it gives you a generic view on whether you are okay to try this as a pilot. But then also I think it's really important to get the user view and the local flavor, because populations are different. We serve a different population in my patch versus somewhere else, even a few miles away. So the use case will be very different for one suite of therapeutics. So one might work for me and my population, but not for another. And I think that this is where it'll be useful to have a generic baseline set of standards, but with the flexibility for us to adapt to local flavor and to share our knowledge and understanding and experiences with each other.
Great. No, that's very helpful. I think we're going to come back to that in terms of evidence generation. Alicia, I'm just wondering, what's your view about the difference that consistently improving the quality of evidence would make to engagement with digital therapeutics? And particularly, I think from a developer's point of view, what's the cost to you in having to produce large amounts of evidence in order to satisfy the sorts of standards that Annie was talking about?
Yeah, and yes, I think Annie also touched on a very important point, and that you're also bringing back, Paul, that is the amount of data that we collect through digital products. So I think that this is actually a huge opportunity, even if there can be challenges. And I think Annie described that very well from both a patient and a clinician perspective. But it's a huge opportunity with digital therapeutics because there is this data feedback loop that digital products can actually support. And I think here we have obviously the clinical data, the clinical outcomes, which we know are incredibly important to build on the clinical evidence and support the clinical validity and effectiveness of a product. But also we have all the data that we're collecting around usage and engagement. And I think that this is also a very interesting area because firstly, this engagement data and how users actually interact with our products, it helps us understand what works, what doesn't work for patients, and how we can enhance the user experience. But also, something I'm very passionate about, and I think like this is also from my research background, is the fact that we can bring together engagement data and clinical data and understand how engaging with a product actually contributes to clinical outcomes. So what's the sweet spot? You know, we talk about adherence, and adherence is incredibly important, but sometimes we want to understand how much do we need to interact with a digital therapeutic to see a difference? Can we understand which people respond better to our product? So, I mean, I know, again, I'm only scratching the surface here, and it's something, you know, I could really talk for a long time. I want to be mindful. Maybe something else I would like to briefly mention, Paul, is also the fact that I think there's so many exciting opportunities in the future around digital therapeutics and how we collect data to help management of long-term conditions. For example, symptom tracking. I think the fact that a patient can go to a clinician, can provide an account of their condition, their key symptoms, without them having to keep detailed notes themselves because their mobile app or their web product is offering an electronic and interactive symptom diary, visual plots that show how their symptom severity changes over time, perhaps even insights into how symptom fluctuations are associated with stress. So these are just some examples that I think, again, the data we collect can also help with the healthcare we deliver and can help clinicians to help patients, if it makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, though I would remind what Annie was saying, that you know, there's a danger of digital overload. And I wanted to finish this particular question with a bit of a probe to Annie on this occasion, which is one of the things that as an ex-GP, a retired GP, one of the things I was always concerned about was, my main concern was my patients and their well-being. But the other thing was, how on earth do we manage the workload? And I just wondered, Annie, I mean, there are two things about digital. One is, if you introduce it, how likely is it to actually make things better, not just for the patients, but for you and your team? And the other is the medico-legal side of things, is, you know, if you are using or prescribing an app, what do you need to make you feel comfortable? Because you can't go through every iteration of every app. With medicines, we have that cover. But I think this is really important at a clinical level. Just a few words on that, if you don't mind, before we go to the last question.
Yeah, I totally hear you there. Capacity is a big issue. There is the danger of too much data overload and actually having something that doesn't really solve the original problem that we had. So you just need to be mindful of that. In terms of recommending an app or a digital therapy, I liken it almost to the same as using the BNF or the MHRA for medicines. I think that would make the most sense to me, in the sense that, you know, the app has to be approved by an approved body or recommended by NICE or something that has got a good use case and evidence base behind it. Now, I understand that many won't have that as yet because it's still a very new and evolving field. And so having other trusted bodies recommending it for us to use will be hopeful. So I suppose from on the coal face, as it were, you would then rely on your local organization, who would then rely on their regional organization almost to recommend certain therapies. So there are a couple of therapies currently in our ICS that's beginning to be recommended through sort of the standard process of procurement. And those are the ones that GPs and clinicians on the ground are offered as possible ones to prescribe and recommend. Pilots and proof of concepts are slightly different because they are the evidence generation sort of things. So that sort of sits aside a little bit. But if I'm going to legally recommend something, then I would want it to come from a trusted source.
Lovely. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I suspect there is a number of comments in the chat that I'm seeing that will take us, I think, into that area. But my last sort of topic for the two of you, and maybe start with Alicia, is, I mean, if we're talking about acceptable standards of evidence, which sounds like it's pretty important in all of this, what do you see as the greatest challenges to achieving these? Alicia, starting with you, and particularly, I mean, is there a consensus about evidence requirements across companies, producers, clinicians, and commissioners? Alicia, what's your view about that?
Yes, I think one of the biggest challenges is, well, and I think, by the way, this has been covered already as part of our discussion, is lack of understanding and dialogue as well around these topics. So let me just explain a little bit more about this. Let's say that now we can see that there is a huge amount of focus on data security. You know, the data assessment is a great example. And I think, you know, the NHS is doing a fantastic work around this and is so important. But as we have been saying during our conversation today, we really need to work together around commissioning. And one of the huge strengths that digital therapies have is that they're scalable. They can be rolled out at a huge volume. And key word that Annie mentioned is also they can be rolled out nationally. So could we have a national commissioning hub for digital therapy treatments? Do we really need local commissioning for problems that are at national? And I think that from a company perspective, there is a barrier to innovation when especially small companies have to constantly apply for local contracts to prove their worth. They have to sell to many different organizations, and this can be a very slow process as well. I know that, of course, now things are changing, and I think, you know, it's very promising that, as you mentioned in the beginning, Paul, we have the NICE guidelines that have been changed around insomnia. There are 2 digital therapeutics available to the entire Scottish population, thanks to a partnership with the Scottish government to treat anxiety and insomnia. Again, incredibly important, but we still need more dialogue to really reach that consensus that you're mentioning, Paul.
Let me just check with you, Alicia. I mean, it's a really interesting point, and we've only got a few more minutes before we open up to the rest of the audience, but just a quick one. As a developer, I mean, there is a huge cost, isn't there, involved in accruing lots of evidence. Maybe what you were talking about earlier is that the sort of user interface is something that can be done very readily, but I think Sleepio, as an example, since we're talking about today, have several large randomized controlled trials, and those take time and money. So I wondered if you might want to comment a little bit on where you sit with that, but also the tension, because what Annie was saying earlier is that, yes, it's great to have these national things, but what clinicians want is to know, will it work in my setting? That's about local commissioning and about local piloting. So quick thought, maybe just a couple of sentences on that.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important topic, Paul, and I think you're right in the sense that sometimes we think that once you get regulatory approval, because you have conducted, you know, randomized controlled trials, very rigorous studies, that's done, right? You have collected all the evidence you need, and you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of time to actually implement digital therapeutics in real world settings, and the evidence generation in these settings is actually key, and it is costly. You're absolutely right for companies. I do think, though, is incredibly needed because it's collecting real world data is what will allow companies and NHS and clinicians to actually adopt these products in the real world. So it's not only about collecting clinical data in the real world. Let's collect adoption, uptake, engagement in the real world. Let's companies try to help HCPs, payers, to actually achieve this successfully, and to understand how we can embed these products, that they will become part of routine care. Let's keep conducting user research. As companies, we need to keep understanding in depth how the product can be enhanced. Ensure we always put patients first. So that has a cost, but it's a cost that really is, I think, incredibly important and worth it, because at the end of the day, once implementation happens in the real world successfully, even if it takes time and there will be barriers, that's going to be not only great and beneficial for patients, but as I was saying, for the national healthcare systems, because there are cost savings and economic evaluations, of course. I'll close with that, Paul. Let's do economic evaluations to understand the tangible benefits also to the healthcare.
Well, that's a very impassioned plea. And I think, one of the questions that inevitably arises, who's going to pay for all of that? But I want to finish with Annie, thinking about where this might take us. I mean, how big a challenge do you think it will be to hardwire evidence generation into digital transformation, if you like, into adoption and implementation of digital therapeutics? Do you see that happening?
I think it should happen, but I suppose the issue constantly we're facing with is capacity in our workforce, and the ability, the technical expertise as well, to be able to understand the data, analyze the data, and evaluate and generate the evidence at local level. Because I think those that can do it are already inundated with a million other things that they have to do. So where do we carve out the time as individuals to be able to help generate this evidence? But I think it's really important to have this dialogue, open dialogue between companies, commissioners, and users, because I think there has to be the user voice brought in very early in the whole journey. Otherwise, your design is just not going to help the actual real world problems, is it? And so to involve users, you do need to carve out the capacity and the time. And I think we do need sort of a mixed approach of a bit of top down with some standardized measures, some general safety initiatives and reassurances, but you also don't want to stifle innovation, because that's where the real change and the real benefit realization will happen. And you have to ask yourself, where is the value in this digital therapeutic that you're going to bring to?
Very interesting. And in fact, one of our earlier webinars did talk about whether you stifle innovation with regulation. I'm just wondering, as I'm about to hand over to Farah and open up the conversation to everybody else, I mean, I think what you're saying is that this is going to be a lot of work to generate the evidence, that everybody who's currently involved in dealing with this is pretty busy already, that there's expense, but yet there's lots of data to be gathered, and that probably having some sort of national initiative would be really helpful. I mean, I'm just wondering whether what you're suggesting is that there should be, the National Institute of Health Research was set up, I think it was 2006 that Sally Davis set it up, Dame Sally Davis set it up to really promote research for health and wealth. And maybe we need a digital bit of that to do the same thing. So there's a digital research workforce that can actually support you guys and make sure that there's time and resource for doing that. And the other thing I would do is just plug one of the things that the organizations involved with the webinars are doing, which is thinking about a digital health evidence generation hub, a national organization, which is indeed, I think, the ambition would be to bring together all the stakeholders that you were talking about. So at that point, I'd like to thank you both very much indeed. Don't go, because there are going to be lots of questions, I think, coming to you, and hand over to Farah, who's been monitoring the questions. Farah, over to you.
Hi, thank you. So we've had a few questions in the chat. So James Robury has written that the social prescribing model have expert, quote, link workers to broker patients into social prescriptions. So something similar could be developed for the digital health space, a digital therapy link worker maybe. So if I go to Annie first to hear what you think about that idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And we were just talking on a London call the other day about digital champions, those that really champion the cause for digital products and therapies. I guess maybe super users is another word for it, I suppose. But yeah, that would support that sort of thing. But the more voices that sort of recommend and endorse digital therapies, the better.
Great, thank you. Going over to Liche now.
Yes, I completely agree with what Annie said and James's point. I on the point of digital therapy link worker, I absolutely love that in our real world evaluations. Within IAPT, for example, we have our therapist champion who is someone who really likes digital therapies, and of course, they're therapists, they know how to deliver that. And what I realized is there is a lot of work and partnership required to actually, especially in the initial phases, to make sure that this person fully understands the digital therapy, the protocol around it, if it's a guided product, if it's unguided, obviously that's not relevant. And once the initial phases happen, that the therapist champion is much more familiar with the product, with the program, and then the rest of the team becomes familiar. I think that that's when the magic happens. But it's so key to have these advocates in the beginning, because I think then the whole process becomes so much easier. And that's how you embed in the real world, exactly like that, so I'm going to stop there, mindful of time, because I know there are more comments.
Could we hear from James to see
yes,
more how
James,
that works?
feel free to come on to the screen. You'll be spotlighted as well if you're still here.
Hi all. No, that was great response, thank you. And I'd say more than an ambassador, what a link worker does is it allows the capacity for the GPs to send these patients on to somebody else that is more of an expert in that area, I guess. So it kind of supports the capacity problem or area, and it allows GPs, I guess, to explore digital therapies with more allowances, so they can continue to see all their patients, but they can actually move more patients when they feel they're ready into this digital therapy space, I guess, to this person that has this expert knowledge, I guess. So no, that's great responses. Thank you. Great session.
Can I ask that back, I suppose, James? Would, rather than having in this digital era that we all live now, rather than sending a patient to a link worker, a person, would it be more in line with our sort of digital hat to send them a text message or an email to link them to a website with digital services that they can choose from? I suppose that's what we do on the ground as well at the moment with our website, with the options for, wellbeing centre and then links to whatever is available there. I wonder if that's where we could go.
No, it's a great, and to have this national kind of brokerage system, maybe they virtually call into. The only problem there is the digital inclusion piece around people that can't access this, but potentially can benefit an awful lot. So we're doing much work around the digital inclusion space, around access and connectivity and the rural spaces and everything, the advantages, the pros, the cons, and so it's a mixture of both, I think, isn't it? So yeah.
Great, thank you so much, James. I'm going to move on to the next sort of comment, I'd say, from Ewan Cranwell, if I've pronounced your name correctly. The comment was that on the procurement frameworks topic, the London procurement partnership, which is the Health and Social Care Apps DPS, is an existing procurement framework for digital apps specifically. Ewan, if you're on the call still, if you want to come on and just elaborate on that comment for our speakers, if you're still here. Possibly not. If you're not here, that's absolutely fine. I'll still pass on to both of our speakers. If I pass on to Annie first about that comment specifically, are you aware of the existing procurement framework for the digital apps, and if you have any comments about it?
We have used the National Procurement Framework to help us with online consultations and various things recently. That's really useful. It's very long, that's what I remember. A lot of specifications that we have to fit. But I'm not aware that it's expanded into digital therapeutics. I thought it was mainly for very limited things at the moment, but maybe there is.
Great, thank you. And pass on to Alice as well.
Yes, I am familiar. We're familiar. We have been in touch, Mahana as a company. And mainly what I would like to add here is perhaps the point again that we discussed earlier, this type of initiative that, you know, are more like a regional initiative. Could we keep working on expanding them at a national level?
Great, thank you so much, both of you. Final comment that we have in the chat from Ian Carr. Ian, if you're still here, feel free to come onto the screen and expand on your comment. I think this was in relation to one of the discussions that was being made. It's that Silver Cloud Health already provides evidence-based ICBT to over 75% of IAP services in England and nationally across NHS Wales and NHS Scotland. So we have Ian here. Thank you so much. Hi everyone. For the screen. Yeah. So feel free to expand on your comment and ask.
Yeah, I suppose the point I wanted to make was that NICE are already doing evidence-based in this area. So they have their evaluation framework, and companies' products can be evaluated from tier A, B, and C. Perhaps not many people knew about that, but that's certainly a push that I think we'll see over the next few months and years to come, where particularly where we've been seeing, and I'm sure Alicia has been too, in the mental health area, there's a real push to find real world evidence. So commissioners and service providers can find those tools that are evidence-based and can be used, particularly in the plethora of, we talked earlier on about wellness apps. There's just so much out there, but really they're, you know, they're not the best, let's say. There's no evidence standing behind them. So yeah, that was just really my point, that there are some great examples out there, and NICE are looking at this area, I suppose, to bring companies to the forefront who do want to use real world evidence.
Great, thank you. I'll pass on to Alice first to respond.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ian. I think this is a great point. In my experience on the work we're doing with IAP centers, it's when the centers are familiar with Silver Cloud, they use Silver Cloud and for their patients. Also makes it easier because it means they're usually open to digital interventions. They're quite familiar to the pros and cons, and they're already, you know, have started adapting the processes to implement. And I think Silver Cloud is a great example. And personally, I know I'm a bit biased because I work a lot with physical problems and physical conditions, but I hope that also with physical long-term conditions, we can follow Silver Cloud Health, that I know they're very much focused on, well, they have a lot of anxiety, depression, but I know they're expanding. So I think this for me is the future also in the context of a step care approach. And I mentioned this because I know there are guided digital programs in, for example, in the context of IAP, and then I know there are unguided versions. So I think that finding also that balance and implementing digital therapies in the context of a step care approach is also something that hopefully it will keep evolving, because it's just kind of, it's a perfect concept that I think works really well with digital innovation.
Great, thank you so much, Alice. I'll pass on to Annie.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the NICE guidelines, because the A to C evidence presentation by NICE I think is really useful, but it doesn't necessarily always recommend a single product, which is great because it's impartial. And it's only Sleepio that has just recently made it onto the news as recommended by NICE. But NICE have had specifications for certain digital therapies. So for instance, continuous blood glucose monitoring has been on NICE since 2017, and it was updated in 22 with new recommendations. But the recommendations are a lot more robust now with more evidence generated to support it. So I see that as a wonderful evolution of how digital therapies are gaining sort of momentum and the evidence behind it. So I really truly support the sort of NICE frameworks. I wonder what you thought about, you know, having generic standards nationally rather than specific standards for specific products. Because I worry that if you get too granular into the detail from your sort of evidence and standardization, that you sort of lose that flair for the local people to actually choose what's best for them. So maybe having flexibility and options for people to choose from might be a better way of doing it.
Great, thank you. If Fran is still on the call, I know that you made a comment earlier on talking about things from a patient's perspective. If you're happy to comment on what's been discussed, feel free to come on the screen and you can be spotlighted. But no worries if not. Or feel free to comment in the chat box as well.
Hello, thank you. I was actually hoping that ORCA, since we have a few ORCA members participating in this webinar, I was hoping in fact that ORCA could possibly comment on this very interesting discussion and what the panel has been covering. May I ask ORCA to intervene if I'm not being too arrogant?
If we have somebody from ORCA very quickly who's happy to, oh, fantastic, Christian, thank you. Please do comment.
Yeah, thank you very much for the inviting us on in discussion. It's really good. I suppose that I work in the UX and design department. So unfortunately, we haven't got anyone who's probably more relevant to the discussion. However, I suppose the only thing we'd like to really mention here is that I suppose that digital is a real disruptor within healthcare, and with that, there comes many challenges, challenges that I suppose other industries have been able to deal with. A risk is always a really big barrier to the adoption of digital health, and on the other side, I suppose that there's the other challenges of, like I said, the time. I think you were mentioning it, Dr. Annie Murphy, that that everyone's lives are so busy generally that it's hard to introduce a new way of working, and especially dealing with products that are fluid. You're used to working with traditional drugs that are tested, they are proved to be working, and there's a pathway for that to be adopted then into your processes to be able to prescribe. Digital's a bit different in that way, is that these products are very much fluid. They can change from month to month. So there's many challenges there that come with it. It's interesting, actually, just finished off a project working with some digital innovators, who can also call them developers, about being able to actually go through the regulations to make sure they are safe. This process can take 6 to 12 months. It can cost upwards of a couple of £100,000, and that is a massive barrier as well. You want to make it inclusive, you want to be able to bring people and innovation into this industry, but also it needs to be secure and safe. So these are the challenges, I suppose, that ORCA are really looking into. There's a lot of barriers, there's a lot of things in place for us to deal with, but we're making progress. All the time we're making progress. We're growing as a company, and I suppose we can't grow quick enough to keep up with the demand, but equally, we don't want to go too fast because there's a lot of risk involved in here, and we're talking about healthcare, so it's something that we really need to try and get right.
Well, Christian, thank you very much, and Farah, thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. It's it's a fascinating topic, and I think both of our contributors and indeed the comments from the floor have made it really fascinating. Left a lot of things unanswered, of course, a lot of challenges. And I want to thank both Alice and Annie in particular, but all of you who've attended and contributed. I'd like to signpost you to the next webinar, which is actually looking at exactly what we were talking about just now, which is how do you hardwire evidence into the whole business of digital transformation? What does it really take to make that happen? And as we were hearing from Christian, I think it's really a very difficult process, but one which I think inevitably has got to be tackled. And I think we've considered it quite a lot today. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.